Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. It's Wednesday, April 2nd, 2025, and today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. And as the last few weeks have been, this week is no different. The news just keeps coming thick and fast, and that's why we cover the news stories of the week in our newsletter that comes out on Monday mornings called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and that's available through subscription free of charge at our website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe. There's also an email version of it that I will drop into the chat so you have it available in case you don't have the subscription already. That comes out by email Monday mornings at typically 9 a.m. and you're welcome to subscribe to that through the email version. However, if you do prefer to get your international education news via LinkedIn, certainly many of you do. I have a LinkedIn version of that same newsletter that you can subscribe to as well. Between the two of those, this one comes out a little bit earlier, about 8:30 on Monday mornings. And that between the two editions now, we have over 2,500 subscribers across the international education landscape in the U.S. and abroad that are getting at least part of their international ed news from us each week. So thank you for those of you who have subscribed to the newsletter. Really grateful that you've made it a part of your weekly international edification. What we do here on Wednesdays is we go next level. We'll give you the hot takes on those news stories on Monday that you get in your inbox or on LinkedIn. And then on Wednesdays, we look at the themes we see developing in the news each week and then coalesce those around three different themes that we think would be most useful to talk about here on Wednesday, and kind of go next level in terms of how some of these news stories can or are impacting what we do in international education, particularly here in the United States. And we talk about that through the lens of the 6 Ps of Strategic International Enrollment Management. And in case you're not familiar with those, that is something that I've developed over the years, crystallized that during the pandemic when all of us had way too much free time, and have put together these 6 Ps to reflect really what I believe are the core principles for how we should be approaching international students and their recruitment, their enrollment, their orientation, their advising, the programming that we do, not just in the international office on our campuses, but throughout their journey as students in the United States until they become successful alumni of our institutions. And that end point is really where we need to start our focus and begin with the end in mind, as Stephen Covey liked to say. I'm particularly fond of that. My son has been educated here in Findlay, Ohio, throughout their K through 12. He's in 9th grade now education. They use Covey's 7 principles of effective leadership, and that first one, begin with the end in mind, is something we really used as one of the motivating factors for developing the SIEM principles that we talked about, the 6 Ps. So part of that is how we approach our questions we answer each week here on the Roundup. We talk about that philosophical connection every once in a while, but as some of the questions warrant. But that's really a foundational piece of why that dose of perspective, which is the first P, is something we always focus on in providing this next level detail on how we think institutions in the U.S. can be adjusting to the ever-changing world of international education, not only here in the United States, but abroad as well. And that global perspective is very handy to have. So the 3 questions we're going to be answering today, first up is, are the 300 students, international students, who've had their visas revoked already, all bad actors? Now this is, depending on who you ask this question to, you will get probably very different answers. And for those who aren't familiar, in the past 2 months, largely the last 2 months, you've seen the administration go after folks, international students, and even folks with green cards who were active in the campus protests that flared on our campuses across the country since October 7th, 23, when Hamas invaded Israel, killed over 1,800 individuals and took hostages, many of which were killed over the last year and a half. So these protests erupted after Israel invaded Gaza and began, for lack of a better term, leveling the entire territory. That this reaction, and what many called the genocide of the Palestinian people, those at least in Gaza, was a clear violation of human rights and all of these other things. And the protests that appeared on our campuses were largely reflective of that desire to show support for the Palestinian people, not necessarily, and here's where the necessarily piece, to be anti-Semitic. And that has certainly been the approach that the administration has taken now, with the changeover from the Biden to the Trump administration effective January 20th, is that the current administration takes a much harder stance towards anti-Semitism, especially how it was reflected on our college campuses after the invasion of Israel by Gaza, and then the subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza, and to root out Hamas, root and stem. And that's really what the crux of what the administration is saying were the folks who were ringleaders of these campus protests. Students, some faculty members have been swept up in some of the detentions, and are now going to be charged or deported if they're found guilty. And the legal process does have its place and is in process of taking shape, and gets a lot of attention when ICE agents pick up students on the streets and take them to detention centers over 1,000 miles away. And that has a very negative impact on public relations, particularly when they tend to be women. Some of them have been women that have been rounded up and sent to these detention centers that their friends would say, no, they've never had any ties to Hamas, but then the government says they have, and who do you believe? So the answer to this question is, are they all bad actors? Time will tell. Far too early to see yet if that is clear. But as evidence has come out on some of the actors involved that have been the more high-profile ones that have been rounded up and are in the process of deportation, whether it's Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia University grad, who is on a green card, has a pregnant wife, and that's being used as a reason why he shouldn't be deported, let alone whether or not he's pro-Hamas or not. What he has done, evidence has come out that he's lied on his application for permanent residency due to his former position with UNRWA, and UNRWA was involved staff of UNRWA were involved in the Gaza attacks in Israel, and that his connection with that group, his work, and obvious support of Hamas, as demonstrated in the protests on Columbia's campus, are the grounds for his deportation. First, the lying on his PR application, his green card application, that's coming out as well. That is probably going to be the main motivation for deportation, but the Hamas links and actions during the protests, which Secretary of State Rubio said are his grounds for removal of national security concerns. So that's the general rule that's being applied in all these cases, that if these individuals are threats to national security, if that had been known in advance before they got their visas to come to the United States, they would never gotten them in the first place. And that deception and hiding of true intent is grounds for dismissal in this case. If the intent to deceive is clear based on their actions since they arrived, and in this case during the protests, those are going to be the grounds for deportation. And if that's the case with all 300, time will only tell. But for the more high-profile ones we've seen, at least 2 or 3 of them have had significant ties. A Brown professor that was coming back from Lebanon had attended Hassan Nasrallah's funeral, and if that's true, that's pro-Hamas sympathies, obviously. Why would you go to his funeral if you don't support what he does? He's a family friend. Tell me another one. So there's some clear issues here with regard to some of the high-profile ones, and if you noticed, many of them have come off these Ivy League campuses, have come off prominent institutions, selective institutions across the country that are now getting the wrath of the federal government. We've already seen Columbia cave to federal government pressure to get back $400 million in grants that it had been receiving from, or scheduled to receive from the federal government. We now see Harvard, 10% of its annual revenue each year is coming from the federal government. They have over $1 billion of loans, or not loans, of grants from the government that is being held for ransom now. And so action needs to be taken from this government's perspective. If you want to continue to receive government funding, you need to clean up your act on campus. And that means having better control over what happens on that campus. And allowing protests to happen is one thing. Allowing destruction of campus property, allowing Jewish students on campus to feel threatened and unsafe, not protecting them and letting protests happen willy-nilly, rampant destruction of property. In those cases, campuses have not lived up to their obligations to protect their students from harm, and then the government is stepping in now to say, hey, you didn't fulfill your obligations as a university, and as a result, you're not going to be, and because and the presidents from these institutions that testified before Congress all failed miserably in defending their inaction in these cases, and that caused most of them to lose their jobs, frankly. So there's real change happening, for good or bad, in this government, and the debates are happening all over LinkedIn. I put out a post last week asking, are U.S. colleges overreacting to what's happening with these removals when it's such a small percentage of our students? Some came to the defense, well, it's creating a circumstance of fear. And again, I said it was an unpopular opinion. I recognize that, to even put it out there. Some said it was what the government's doing is creating a climate of fear, and that is true. And it gets exacerbated by the national press that focuses on these few elite institutions that are really the challenging ones, for where the government's focusing its attention, where the majority of the protests that are now the reaction to those protests, and particularly the more extreme ones, is happening. You don't see this happening on lesser known institutions in red states that typically didn't have the level of protests and certainly the violence involved in protests as some of the more prestigious schools that get all the national attention. So that's my point in making it an overreaction. The press never helps calm a situation down. They only serve to exacerbate it. And that's what I think has happened. So the 300, and the first many of us heard about this 300 was last week. In fact, it was right after that post I put out happened. The Axios released a report that had the State Department admitting 300 students had their visas revoked. Now, where are they in the actual stages of deportation? We don't know yet. Deportation. We don't know all the specifics of every individual case, and that was my point in the article too, in commenting to somebody on one of their comments. It was that how do we know that this person who was arrested at UCLA last year has had her visa revoked, and now she's in deportation proceedings? How do we know she was a bad actor? And it's like, I said I took a look at some of that footage, and she looked like she was a stone cold supporter there, and a lot of her words were pro-Hamas words that she reflected as one of the leaders of those protests. So it's no wonder she got deported, or is in the process of being deported. But many of my colleagues who I've known for years and who I trust for years and who I've shared experiences with around the world will tell you, this all comes down for them to freedom of speech. and what is protected speech. And we've had this conversation here on the Roundup before about what actually qualifies as protected speech. And we've talked about what the State Department's going to be using. They're going to be using AI tools to identify, based on footage from those protests, what language people used and said, and whether any of their language and actions were pro-Hamas in terms of meeting that threshold for the State Department to view them as a security risk, a national security threat, by doing certain things, by acting a certain way, by saying certain things. Not all speech is protected. We all know that. The Supreme Court has verified that to be true numerous times. So there is no blank check on terms of what you can say. And to think that because we're on a university campus, we have some sort of special privilege, that's not true either. Learning right and wrong and what is allowed and what is not allowed and what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, is a part of growing up and facing the consequences for actions, and perhaps being on campuses where those the professors or lax administration enforcement create a climate where, hey, students feel emboldened to do more than just speech, to express their frustration with policy. You need to be an adult about this. You can't do what you want, where you want, when you want. We're in a society. We live in a community with others, especially on a university campus. It's never more true than on a university campus. Those living learning labs that we talk about so much as such a benefit of who we are as U.S. institutions is also there need to be standards there. And when there aren't, and students feel like they can get away with things that in normal society they would not be able to get away with, then universities are partly to blame for it. And by creating that culture of, yes, freedom of speech is unlimited here, we allow student groups. No institution will say that, though, because they'll put certain groups, you can only do protests between certain hours on certain days, and have to get a permit and approval from the state student government or other officials on campus. So there are always restrictions. So those exist and have always existed on college campuses. The fact is the universities don't step in to control situations. And we had at UNLV, was working there when the initial protests started happening. I was actually out on campus a couple times when some scheduled protests were going on. And some of the language that was used as the organizers were marching up and down, it was very peaceful, thankfully. Nothing happened. There was a clash in terms of the Israeli students or pro-Israel students were waving a flag. There was a much smaller group than the pro-Palestine group, and they met together at a certain point on campus, but it was resolved peacefully. Police stepped in, separated them, and they went on their ways. And they continued. Some of the things, the language that some of the protesters on the bullhorns that were leading the Palestinian protests, even on that campus, were very inflammatory towards Israel, from the river to the sea, all of that. Showing Palestine will be free. All of that is certainly the end goal of from the river to the sea is the destruction of Israel. And there's nothing more anti-Semite than that. So that's in terms, there's a lot of language that gets used that does get kind of brushed under the carpet. But when lines are crossed and support for Hamas is expressed and direct action is taken that reflects that support, that's when institutions have to step in. And that's now, since institutions have not stepped in, that's when the government's stepping in. Is that right or wrong? And is it happening on such a broad scale so it's causing a lot of angst and fear? And I don't think the fear really is nationwide. I don't think it's with every international student. Certainly the vast majority of international students that are in the United States are never going to be running afoul of the law in this case. The vast majority never get involved in protests on campus because it's frankly not something that they are used to or would do in their own countries. So they don't come here, and some get convinced that when they get meet another fellow student who has a righteous cause and they feel they want to support their friends, and they get involved. But the majority now will step back and say, probably not the best idea for my visa status to get involved in student protest. And there's nothing wrong with students who take that decision, and let's be clear about that. Where the fear involved, and the fear is involved, and this is where the press does not help the situation by basically painting this, well, all international students should worry for their lives. And I've seen press reports that say that. I've seen colleagues who've irresponsibly said that, because it's not all international students have to worry for their futures here. You follow the rules, you won't get deported. There's no reason, and you can enjoy the full remainder of your studies and well as your OPT and STEM OPT, hopefully, if you have it, and continue along your merry way. So there are a lot of folks who doubt that this is just the beginning, and there may be more coming. There may be more coming, but there are going to be legal challenges where legal challenges are appropriate and right and possible. And in fact, most of these students that have been rounded up will go through some sort of legal process before their visas are. The visa may have been revoked, but there's talk that they have a legal due process. And that's the peace due process we all hope does happen, and that's certainly an important part of our foundation as a country is innocent until proven guilty. And the government makes their case. They've revoked visas, and now then it goes through a court case and that's step one. Then the next step is legal proceedings, due process, and then eventual deportation if they're found guilty. So there are other students. We've just seen one of the activists that was arrested at Cornell. He was a dual national, I think Guinea and the UK. His words and his actions were very pro-Hamas. He was suing the government to prevent them from doing similar things on other college campuses, but he's self-deported now. So he's kind of given up the fight. He probably saw the writing on the wall. I want to be deported. I'm just going to leave on my own. So that's probably the wise move for any of those serious bad actors who if they haven't been caught up in the net so far, they should probably leave and not save themselves and public defenders and then for anyone else, costs for their family, for the legal proceedings. If your actions are clearly in defiance of these statutes that show that you are a national security risk, then you might as well. Writing's on the wall. Leave. And as Senator Rubio said, if you had said that before you got your visa to come here, and if we had known that you were that supportive of Hamas, and as a recognized terrorist organization, remember, if they were that supportive of Hamas and you would express that during your visa interview, you never would have been allowed in the country in the first place, because it is a privilege, not a right. And as much as we don't like to say that in our international ed profession, it is a reality. So students cannot come in with bad intents and hide those from our frontline staff, consular officers that review their applications. And as much as I begrudge them, and I don't think it would actually come out in an interview, and that we're the only major country that requires an interview for students to come into the country. UK, Canada, Australia do not. So we have, there have been stories out recently about visa denial rates have been up at record levels in all the big four major countries. And while that's true, our visa denial rate is outrageously high this year. It was 41% in 2024. It's never been that high. So that means 59% only of visa applicants got visas to come to the US. To Canada, to Australia, to the UK, it's 89% or higher. 89% was like a record low for Canada, but now they're back up into the 90s. 90% of students getting visas. Can you imagine if those numbers actually were true in the United States? And I think the main reason they are true, that ours are so low, is because of these visa interviews that put so much power and influence in the hands of these consular officers. And that's not always a good thing. We've heard countless stories of questions that were asked by consular officers that clearly didn't have the first clue about what a community college is, or why would you ever go to that school because it's not a top-ranked school. You've got great grades. Why would you go there? It's like, I won't go too far into this because I can get myself into trouble. I don't want to do that. But we give far too much power to frontline consular officers in our visa process. None of the other big four do that. and we pay the price in terms of lower approval rates, significantly fewer countries because of the volume our students we have coming in every year. So if we just look at the number of new international students that came in last year, we had, let's see, 300,000 new internationals start last year. I think somewhere upper 280s, low 300,000s. That's based on a roughly 60% visa approval rate. The other big three are at least 90%. So they received 30% more of their students who applied for visas got them going to them than got coming to us. We already know in India last year we had a 40% drop off in visa approvals. So that's a huge part of the drop I think we had last year overall. But if you think about what just if we were on par with some of the other big four, if we were on par with them, that would have been 100,000 more international students last fall, than we had if our visa approval numbers were at the same levels. That's all down to our already rigid security clearances, which are only supposed to get harder when consular officers are now told to look at all social media of applicants before they make decisions. And really, that's where the decisions are getting made. They're not getting made in that one-on-one interview, and if they are, they shouldn't be. There's some real challenges in that process. So long answer to a question there. Are the 300 students who have had their visas revoked all bad actors? We will see. We don't know yet. We don't have the evidence. We're not supposed to have the evidence with the general public. We're not a court of law, and we shouldn't be trying those decisions in the court of public opinion. Now, second question, will funding be restored 100% to State Department programs? Fulbright, Education USA, Gilman, Humphrey, all the other major scholarships that exist that are managed by cooperating organizations like IIE and others. It does look like funding has gotten back. As of last week, end of last week, it was about 85% of funding had been restored. And I think it was Mark Overman at the President's Alliance had confirmed that. And we now we're seeing, and this was on back payments, 85% of payments owed had been processed. So that's certainly a positive to know that is moving forward and hopefully getting up to 100% soon. The other activities that we're seeing on this front is that some of the staff in some of these programs are starting to get hired back on that have been furloughed. Haven't had any word officially yet from EdUSA on whether their staff has been rehired yet or taken off furlough. So we'll certainly post in the newsletter when and if that does happen. Certainly give them a shout out when they're back at work once we know those details. But certainly there's more positive signs. And again, this was all part of an initial pause on federal government funding for third parties, individuals as well, that the government made after the inauguration. This was not targeting just international education. It was, as with what DOGE has been doing, it was really a government-wide approach to how we spend our money as a country. And that really hasn't happened as quickly and as thoroughly and as high profile way as it has been done over the last 2 months. So there's been a lot of backlash and efforts by DOGE and Elon Musk and the team he's assembled. They're finding redundancies in government and trying to plot and make those clear that this is happening. And is that a bad thing? Absolutely not. And he's got some really smart people that are working on these issues for him, and that's something that's a great public service, frankly, in my opinion, is that if they are identifying proper waste and duplication of effort and mismanagement in government, this is our money that the federal government is entrusted with to spend each year. It's not a right that they have to just create all these redundancies, have their budgets increase each year, pad their budgets accordingly. This is something that, as taxpayers, we should want our government to do, to be prudent with the money we give them every year. Why is, and some people seem to have a problem with that. I don't quite get that. So the review process that's happened and is nearing its conclusion with these education programs is a good thing. It's happened at a time where there was going to be short-term pain because it had never been done before in this manner, and it's upset the apple cart on a lot of different projects and programs, and I get it. And people are their livelihoods have been put in jeopardy. We've seen folks in different parts of government lose their jobs. Folks that have just been hired new as probationary employees are losing their jobs that they just received because the government can cut them easier than they can someone who's been on staff for 30 years. The process of retiring in the federal government from the federal government is just onerous and takes months and is still done out of a bunker somewhere in the mountains somewhere, Appalachian mountains. So there's some real challenges with the way government operates and some real inefficiencies that are being examined, and it does and has caused some short-term pain. So if there's long-term gain coming out of the back end of this, I'm all for it. I'm not all for the damage that it's done. Probably could have been handled a lot cleaner, and review processes wouldn't necessarily of current year's payments should not have been perhaps stopped for 15 days, and which has turned into 2 months. Though that process should have been a much smoother one, and who knows what kind of internal roadblocks were faced in terms of getting that money or those review processes done. But it's happened. So we're coming toward the end of that process. So to say, and again, having some perspective, stepping back and looking longer term, okay, what have they been able to do in the first 2 months in terms of assessing the waste that's happening in government, where the money was going from USAID and the corruption that has always existed in that program in some recipient countries, and money getting lost. The money that was sent to Ukraine, they can't account for most of that. So there's some real issues with how money is given and who it's given to that needed to be identified as challenges in the way the current government operates. So I certainly don't have problems with that. Last quick bit of news that we'll cover is one that kind of caught my eye, and I hadn't. Most of us have kind of turned our attention away as a primary focus of expanding recruitment efforts within China over recent years because of COVID, the pre-COVID decline that had already started, that bottomed out with the pandemic, is what's happening in China as a recruitment area. It's still the largest. It actually, because of what happened last fall, CVIS by the numbers reports actually have China overtaking India as the most popular country amongst international students in the United States right now. As of, I think November was the last report I saw, or maybe it was January. Anyway, that January report actually, CVIS by the numbers, showed that there were more Chinese in the U.S. than Indians as of January 2025. So that is all down to the 40% fewer new Indian students that started this fall. So they were close before, and then this past fall they flipped back. So China's now back on top. So it's never not going to be the number one or number two market, as much as one Republican congressman who had a bill to ban student visas to Chinese applicants. Not going to happen, won't pass ever. But certainly the numbers of Chinese coming to the U.S. is it actually they're now back on top as number one source. So it's not going away, and shouldn't, because we need Chinese students just as much as they need us. In academia, in our economies, we're intertwined. So tariffs be damned in the middle of it. But the Chinese agent landscape has really transformed since the pandemic. New Pi News article is quite illustrative of what those challenges are, and I think it's well worth a read when you have time to understand that what's happening in China. The market has become much more fragmented. There used to be 3 or 4 major, huge players that had the majority of agencies in the country under their umbrellas. Now it's fragmented, and there's much more segmented market. Many more mom and pop shops that are starting up in tier 2 and tier 3 cities across the country that are becoming drivers of many students abroad. And they're not all just coming to the big 4 anymore. You see a lot of regional hubs in Hong Kong, in Malaysia. I found out in the last couple of weeks, Malaysia, the majority of their international students, 40% are coming from, or not majority, but the largest plurality of international students going to Malaysia are from China. In Singapore, I think it's the same. So there's that happening across the countries in Asia as well. That there are other destinations that Chinese students are also considering outside of the big 4. So a lot going on. Obviously, we'll keep you abreast every week here on the Roundup with some of our next level thoughts on what is happening in our industry. But do also subscribe to the newsletter if you haven't already. Really appreciate you being with us, and we look forward to chatting with you again next week. Cheers.